Up next in this spooky Halloween episode of Dark Winter Nights, True Stories from Alaska, Art and Cyndie Warbelow get entangled in a hunt for a ghost that nearly ends in gunplay.
He kind of crouches down, draws his handgun, dashes forward and traces the sights across the apple trees. I thought my apple trees were going to die in a hail of bullets.
The Ghost in the Garage, up next on Dark Winter Nights, True Stories from Alaska. I'm Rob Prince. In my mind, there are few creepier things than security camera footage. There's something about the odd, unusual angle of the camera and the grainy, low-quality video that makes the footage inherently creepy. So it's no surprise to me that today's storyteller was taken aback when his security cameras started alerting him to eerie, unexplained objects moving in his garage. Art Warbelow and his sister Cyndie together shared this ghost story on stage at our February 2024 live event in Fairbanks.
The story that I'm going to describe to you tonight took place in September and October 2017 at my house at the east end of Chena Ridge. And to the best of my knowledge and memory, everything I'm going to tell you tonight is true, notwithstanding the fact that I've already used the word ghost. But I only use that word as a placeholder for something that even now, 7 years later, I cannot explain some of the events that I witnessed that fall and some of the images that I saw recorded on my Nest security camera. So I invite you to draw your own conclusions about what was happening actually in my garage that fall as I describe these events and images. Now, the previous year, I'd contracted with Tim Sonnenberg of TS Construction to build a 2-story, 28 by 40-foot garage in my front yard. It was built on sloping ground such that the upstairs doors that faced my living room windows opened on a deck at ground level. And there was an exterior set of stairs that went from that deck down to the entry door on the left side of the building at the lower level, which is at ground level at that end. And that entry door had a large glass window in it, which was the only natural light that went into the lower floor because it was mostly below grade. In fact, it was built out of ICF blocks, so the walls were solid poured concrete except for the openings for the doors. And this project, like most construction projects, was over budget and behind schedule, but by end of 2017, there was just a punch list of items that needed to be done. But Tim had moved on mentally and physically to other projects that he was trying to get closed in before winter set in earnest. So his crew, some of his crew would just come by when they had a few hours and work on this punch list. But I'd grown impatient and I'd started to move some of my tools and equipment in crates and boxes and cases into the back of the shop and stack them up while waiting to unpack them. And I was parking some vehicles in there at night sometimes. And for that reason, I had some expensive stuff in there, so I was locking the doors, and that entry door had a key or a combination lock. And I'd given a key to my sister because she watches over my house sometimes when I'm out of town. And I'd set a combination on the combination lock so Tim's crew could get in there whenever they needed to, even if I wasn't around. And on the far end of that shop, facing away from my living room windows on the bottom story, were two 8x10 overhead door brand garage doors with automatic openers and remote controls. And one morning I went down to the shop and one of those doors was up. And I thought it was kind of odd, but I thought maybe I'd forgotten to close it or one of Tim's crew had forgotten to close it. But it continued to happen. I'd go down to the shop in the morning and a door would be open. So I had a similar garage door in my house, and I had stopped by Overhead Door on College Road there, and they'd sold me a 3-button controller that would open all 3 of those doors, and I had programmed that controller myself. So I called up Overhead Door and had them send one of their factory-trained technicians over, and had them inspect Tim's installation of the 2 doors in the shop and my programming of the remote control operator to make sure everything was working correctly. And they looked at all 3 doors, checked everything out, that everything was working correctly. But I would go down to the shop in the morning occasionally, and one of those doors would be up. So I decided to install a Nest security camera in the shop for the purpose, two things. One, I wanted to be able to, when I went to bed at night, look at the video camera and see whether the doors were down before I went to bed, since I had the Toyo boiler running and heat in the floor. And also, I wanted to see when the door was opening and see if it was correlated with something I was doing in the house, like maybe opening the garage door in the house, had a fat finger and pressed one of the buttons for the shop door, or some other electrical equipment that was interfering with the garage doors. So I installed the camera on one of the two steel beams that held up the upper story near the end where I could plug it into the wall. So it was about 8 feet up in the air and about 20-some feet back from the door, pointed at the two garage doors, took in the front half of the shop. And a few days later, well, for those of you who are not familiar with Nest security cameras, they have three functions. They capture a video image if they see any movement and record it. And they send you an email, and when you open that email, you press on a link, it loads the Nest app, and you can see the chronological list of saved images or look at the live video feed. Two, they have a built-in microphone and speaker, so you can talk with the intruder or hear noises that they're making. And three, they have a infrared lighting system, so they can take a video in total darkness. The intruder doesn't see any light, but it can capture a full motion, black and white video of slightly lower resolution, but it's still a very high quality video image. So a few days later, I wake up in the morning and there's a message from the camera. They're suspended over or sitting on the hood of my pickup, which I had parked in the garage that night, was what I can only describe as a ghost, Casper the ghost. He looked like he was fully 6 or 7 feet tall, well-formed, symmetrical, a couple of eyes looking at the camera, a 3-part tail. Parts of his body were translucent. You could see things behind him. Parts of his body were opaque. It blocked what was behind him. And Casper just appeared in the video from a point in space, expanded to this size, and then just sat motionless on the hood of the pickup for several seconds, and then shrunk down and disappeared. I mean, I was speechless. What could this possibly be in my shop? So I thought I just needed to, get a plan and figure out what this was all about. And so while I was thinking about it, a few days later, I woke up in the morning, and there was a message from the camera. Casper wasn't there, but there was what looked like a hammock or some kind of a chaise lounge hanging in the middle of my shop. I didn't have a car in there that night, so it's hanging out in the middle of the shop. It looked like there was maybe one line going up to a hinge on the garage door, maybe suspending one corner of it, but otherwise it was just hanging in the middle of the garage. And it looked like, maybe Casper was trying out some furniture in there and planning on a long-term stay and wanted to be more comfortable or something. So with the mystery kind of deepening, I decided I need to get a 3-dimensional look at whatever is out there. So I need another camera. So I went over to Home Depot and I bought another camera. And I mounted the magnetic base for that on top of my Toyo stove, which was in the opposite corner of the shop from the entry door. And I set it up so it could not only see the two garage doors out of its peripheral vision, but it was looking back directly at camera number 1. So anything that was in the field of view of camera 1 was also in the field of view of camera 2. And so I set my ghost trap, and I waited.
Well, by now, you've probably figured out that my brother was obsessed with that supposed ghost in his garage that year. And every time I talked to him, I would get the latest on the ghost, whether I wanted to hear it or not. And I could accept that. But when he started talking about having to get another camera so he could see it in 3 dimensions, frankly, I thought he'd gone over the edge. But then one day in early September, I got an idea. How much fun would it be to give him a real three-dimensional ghost in his garage? I could do that. But I needed a couple of things to be true. First, I needed my brother to leave his house for a reliable amount of time, a situation in where he could get a message from his camera through his phone that something was going on in his shop, but where he couldn't respond right away. I got wind of the fact that Art was going to Anchorage for a day, returning on the 8 p.m. Frontier flight. So this was my chance. So at this time, our mom was 102, and she lived in the Pioneers home. And one of her favorite things to do was have me come and get her, take her to Mocha Dan's, get a coffee, and then we would go over to Art's house, and he would come out and sit in the car, and he and I would visit, and Mom would sit there with her eyes closed, drinking her coffee, and periodically interjecting a comment, or more likely a correction, into our conversation. So I thought this would be my perfect alibi. So about 6 o'clock the night that Art was in Anchorage and I was gonna go up to his house, I texted him and I said, I brought Mom by to see you, but I forgot you were in Anchorage, so I'm taking her back to the Pioneers home and I'm going home. It would have been the perfect alibi, but I forgot to push send. And also I should tell you that Art's daughter and son-in-law, Kylan and Andrew, lived just down the road from him. And they too had heard the ghost story ad nauseum that summer. And when I got my idea in September, I divulged it to them and they thought it was a great plan. So before I left the house that night, I contacted them. First I wanted to let them know what I was up to. And then I thought they might want to be involved. But they, fortunately for them, had planned a dinner date, and they were going to be at a restaurant. So about 6:30, I left my house and drove up to my brother's house. Then I put on my all-white ghost attire. And then I put the sheet over my head. And that was my first major setback. I thought it would be transparent, or at least translucent, but it was opaque. I couldn't see anything. So I basically had to kind of surreptitiously lift up one corner and crab walk for 200 to 300 feet. When I got to his shop, I unlocked the door, and luckily I left the door open just a little bit because it was dim outside, but it was really dark in his shop. I couldn't see anything. And so I went in and I floated around mysteriously for not very long until my very solid head hit the rearview mirror of my brother's truck. And at that point, a very loud voice came out of the dark.
Get the hell out of my shop. This is God speaking.
Well, I knew it wasn't God. But I also knew that my brother was now aware that he had a full three-dimensional ghost at loose in his garage. And so I opened and closed the door of his truck a couple times just for effect, and then I floated out and hightailed it, crab fashion, back to my car. And when I got to the car and took off my sheet, I saw that I had a text, and it was from Kylan. And she said, "Dad has already called us. He's pretty excited." He thinks there's somebody in his shop dressed in a sheet stealing his stuff. So I texted back and said, perfect, but would you guys stop on your way home and lock the shop because I forgot to. And then I also noticed the text that I had forgotten to send. And its value, as an alibi had diminished significantly, but I sent it anyway. And then I saw that there was a very short gobbledygook text from my brother that he had sent just a couple minutes before. And he said something like, I assume you know what's going on in my shop. I hope you're not involved. I might have to call the troopers, Like he would call the troopers. And on the way home, I burst out laughing repeatedly, thinking how clever I was, how funny I was, and what a perfect trick I had played on my very unsuspecting baby brother.
So I was down at the north end of the Anchorage International Airport terminals in the old A gates waiting for the Frontier flight back to Fairbanks. And I was standing in the boarding queue there. The plane was supposed to leave in a few minutes. And my phone beeped. And I looked, and sure enough, something was going on in my shop back in Fairbanks. So I loaded the video feed and looked, and to my astonishment, the door swings open, the door that I'd locked when I left, and in walks somebody with a sheet over their head. So the only people that could open that door and get in other than me was my son-in-law, who had the combination, my sister, who had the key, and all of Tim's crew. Well, I immediately jumped to the conclusion that Tim must have a rogue carpenter, maybe somebody that just fired today, and they had a grudge, and they knew that combination. They knew all that equipment I had stacked in the back of the shop. And they knew that there were cameras in there if they'd worked in there, so they'd need to, disguise their identity as they came in. I know you might think I'm paranoid to jump to that conclusion so quickly, but I had had something similar to happen to me before. Many years before, I was building a cabin at Moose Mountain, and I'd hired an itinerant carpenter who I didn't know, but the price was right. And he'd installed a yellow pine tongue and groove floor for me in the cabin, and he'd stayed in the cabin for a couple weeks while he did it. Well, a couple months later, he showed up back there with a duplicate key, stole all my hand tools, 2 steel chainsaws, and my Martin hat. I wasn't going to let that happen again. So I could see the intruder clearly in the infrared light on the video camera, but I could tell that they couldn't see anything because they were feeling down the side of the pickup with their hand until their head bumped into the mirror. And as they ducked down under the mirror, I pressed the virtual button on the Nest app and I said, "Get the hell out of my shop. This is God speaking." Several of the other passengers that were standing in the in the boarding queue with me turned their head and looked at me curiously. And it was at that moment that I realized that the battery indicator on my phone had just changed from 3% to 2%. And I realized if I continued to watch this live video feed, I wouldn't have any battery power even to make a phone call. And my charger was in the bag that I'd checked. And then I thought about my sister. She's got a key to that door. So to conserve battery power, I texted her. And I said, it was short and to the point. I said, "Somebody's in my shop with a sheet over their head. If you know anything about it, I'm calling the troopers." And I pressed send. And within a minute, just a matter of seconds, I got a response back from her. And it was very casual. She said, "Oh, well, I went over to the Pioneers home and picked up her mom and got some coffee, and I went to your house, and then I realized you weren't there, so we drank the coffee, and I took Mom back and dropped her off, and I'm home now." What was she trying to tell me? Maybe she was trying to tell me she'd just been at my house, nobody was there, everything's okay, there's nothing to worry about. And surely she wouldn't have had any reason to go into my shop with a sheet over her head, leave her 102-year-old mother in the car in the dark alone. It didn't seem responsive to my text. But I was out of time, and I was out of battery power. Everybody else had loaded on the airplane. The gate agent called out and asked me if I was going to Fairbanks. And I thought, if I get back to Fairbanks and I find that somebody has stolen all my equipment in my pickup while I watched them on a security camera and did nothing about it, I'd look like a fool. So I decided to act. So I dialed Alaska State Trooper Dispatch in Fairbanks, and I explained my dilemma to them.
Just as I drove in my garage and the door was coming down, my phone rang. And it was Kylan. And her voice was abnormally high-pitched. And she was talking much faster than usual. I won't even try to mimic the conversation here, but basically she said, "Aunt Cyndie, we just came over to Dad's house to relock the shop door, and we drove in here, and there are 4 trooper cars and a university cop car here. There is a trooper on the deck of the shop panning the area with some kind of pistol, and we were afraid to drive in here, but we couldn't turn around. So we drove down toward the shop, and a trooper burst out the door of the shop with a big dog. They have a canine unit here looking for you, for the ghost." So Andrew kind of tried to indicate we're coming in peace so we wouldn't get shot. And he rolled down his window, and the trooper held the dog back, and Andrew said, "I think I can explain what's going on here." And then he kind of threw me under the bus because he said, "I think his sister and his daughter are playing a trick on him." Well, I instantly felt sick to my stomach, and I didn't feel that funny and clever anymore. And I felt maybe this is the stupidest thing I'd ever done. So, and several thoughts came to my mind, and the first one was, what if I was financially responsible for the cost to the state of Alaska of dispatching 4 troopers, a canine unit, and a university policeman to a crime scene, to a bogus crime scene, and to a bogus crime scene that I personally had created. I might, this is probably illegal, and I might have crossed the line between practical joke and criminal activity. I might be on the front page of the News Miner tomorrow, one of my worst fears. Or I might, even worse, be in jail trying to find an attorney to represent a person like me. So I decided the best thing to do was face the music. I decided I should probably just drive back over to Kylan and Andrew's. Their house was on the way from the airport to Art's house. And I figured Art would probably stop in. Well, I knew he would stop in. He would have the latest. He would be bursting with information about the 3-dimensional ghost in his garage.
So when I arrived back in Fairbanks, my battery in my phone still had a gasp of power. So I called the troopers. And the dispatcher that answered gave the phone to one of the responding troopers who still happened to be standing there in dispatch. And so I breathlessly asked her, what did you find in my shop? And there was a long pause, and she said, "I thought your family would have called you by now." So I drove back over to my house and plugged my phone in and charged it up. And then I realized that my video cameras had captured the assault on my shop by the troopers. And as the lady that I talked to on the phone in dispatch, she was the canine dog handler, and as she opened the door, flicked the lights on, shouted, "Alaska State Troopers," and turned a very large, very excited German Shepherd loose to hunt down the intruder. It was pretty impressive. And another trooper went up the exterior staircase to guard the upper doors in case the intruder went up the interior staircase and escaped out those doors. Well, while he was standing on the deck guarding that door, he suddenly noticed my 3 apple trees that I'd planted nearby. And I had wrapped those in the previous fall in white garden fabric to prevent the moose from eating them. White fabric that made the 7-foot-tall apple trees look pretty much like a person with a sheet over their head. On the video, he kind of crouches down, draws his handgun, dashes forward, and traces the sights across the apple trees. I thought my apple trees were going to die in a hail of bullets. Well, it was the week before Halloween, so I had no problem stopping by Fred Meyer's the next morning and getting a ghost-themed Halloween card on which I wrote my apology and inserted the $100 gift certificate to the Cookie Jar restaurant and dropped it off at Trooper Dispatch. I didn't ask to talk to any of the responding troopers. Now, what about the ghost? Some people have suggested that maybe that image of Casper could have been created by an insect, attracted by the heat of the infrared light that landed on the lens of the camera, and the camera couldn't focus on it at that range. Could the image of Casper have been created by an insect just landing on the lens of the camera? And I have 5 other Nest security cameras around my shop and house. Including camera number 1, the relevant camera that took all these images. And in the last 7 years, that camera has never, ever captured an image like this again. So in closing, I'd just like to say that the Alaska State Troopers have seen some bloopers. But the strangest they ever did see was that dark winter night I played host to a sheet-covered counterfeit ghost. 'Twas my sister just messing with me. She thought she was clever and cool, made me look the fool. And as memories fade of that long ago date, she tells a story to all who will hear. Lives her life without fear. But the time and the place for revenge I await. Thank you.
Art and Cyndie Warbelow. They shared that spooky story at our February 2024 live event in Fairbanks. Thanks for listening to this edition of Dark Winter Nights, True Stories from Alaska, the Ghost in the Garage episode. Today's episode was edited by myself, Rob Prince, story consultation by Lori Neufeld. Remember, these are the stories we tell up here in Alaska on Dark Winter Nights. I'm Rob Prince.